It has been a while since I have made a video, so I figured I would come back and make one that has been requested quite a bit. And that is to revisit magic DPS now that we have tier 95 dual wield weapons. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get into the updated DPS guide. So this update is only going to cover the new weapons and adaptations I've made to any of my rotations beforehand. And I need to put a quick disclaimer out there that these are just rotations that I have used so far. These are not the best rotations out there by any means, and they're probably going to get better over time, and I'll make updates as I see fit to any of my rotations, or in guides going forward I will be adding those rotations in. But I think a good starting place is the weapons themselves, the Roar of Awakening and the Ode to Deceit. Now these are the first dual wield weapons to have a actual passive and special attack to them. Appraisals, Seismics, Kaiwir Wand Orb, these all were just standard weapons, and the only difference between them was the accuracy that they had and the damage you could put out with the spell selected. But this Wand and Orb, as you can see, actually has a passive effect. Now for just equipping these weapons, meaning the passive effect, you are getting a stack that you can build with each bleed casted. These bleeds include Corrupt Blast, Combust, and the wand spec itself, and these stacks have different effects the more stacks you build up. I'll have an image overlaid here with a screenshot of the actual stacks and what they do. The stacks are called the Essence Corruption stacks, and at one stack, so literally after you press any of the bleeds, the very first hit, any bleed after that will have a 30% chance to just automatically dump all of the hits at once on the target instead of doing their usual bleed of hitting every 2 or 3 game ticks, and it will refresh the cooldown of said bleed. And with the 30% damage increase that you get, which is the second passive, you just automatically get a 30% damage increase just for holding this Wand and Orb on bleeds specifically. And again, this is for Corrupt Blast, Combust, and the wand spec. Now Magma Tempest does not benefit from any of these passives that you can get or any of the stacks. I think it's technically because Magma Tempest is something you place, and it's kind of like an area of effect where like you put it down on a certain tile range and those will take damage over time bleeds rather than a dedicated damage over time bleed that you would place on an individual target. But Magma Tempest is still a pretty strong ability, so I would still recommend using it. Now when you hit 25 stacks of the Essence Corruption, you will start doing increased magic damage, and again this is tied to the dual wield weapons. So if you have the corruption stacks and you go to equip your FSOA and do an ability with it, then you're not going to get the damage buff, nor are you going to get the bleed buff, because FSOA doesn't have that passive. And once you hit 50 stacks for a small window of time after you hit a bleed, basic abilities will generate additional adrenaline. It's 3% adrenaline over 3.6 seconds. Now this doesn't seem like a whole lot, but it can add up if you really build up the stacks. Say you have a very long boss fight or you're running through an elite dungeon or something. This extra adrenaline can come in handy. I haven't really theorycrafted anything around it so far, but it has been nice just to get extra adrenaline. You know, it's one of those things where the more adrenaline you have, the better off you're probably going to be. Now these stacks will stay on your player for 30 seconds. These aren't stacks that go on a target. They will just stay in your buff bar up here. Like if I just hit a bleed real quick, you will see they start building up here, and they're building up quickly because Corruption Blast can AoE. And that's another thing, is if you use G-Chain or have a Corrupt Blast hitting a bunch of targets, that's a very quick way to build up stacks. So if I just go ahead and hit G-Chain here, and then I hit the Combust. Combust is normally a single target, but as you can see, the stack's going up very quickly because it is hitting multiple targets at once. Now for the keen observers out there, you might have noticed something with that G-Chain proc, but I'm going to explain that a little bit later on when we get into more of the intricate details in how some of these effects work with things like G-Chain and other things with primary, secondary targets and stuff like that. So if you stay in combat for 30 seconds and you keep hitting bleeds, that will refresh the timer. So think of it kind of like Bic arrows, but instead instead of just using any ability that gains a Bic arrow stack, you have to use a bleed to upkeep that timer because bleeds are the only thing that generate the stack in the first place. Now the wand here does have a special attack and it's very, very powerful. I would almost consider this a second Omni power. Someone in my Twitch chat said it's basically a second Omni power in terms of power level, and I pretty much agree. So if I go up to a target and I hit the wand spec here, it will go ahead and hit 2 hits initially and then apply a bleed. So it's kind of acting like a dead shot, but it's hitting 4.6k. It's very strong. And if you already have 1 stack built up, you're rolling essentially what is a 1 in 3. I know 1 in 3 is 33.3, but I'm just going to call it 1 in 3 for simplicity's sake, to have it refresh, and then you'll just see a giant amount of hits just pop up all at once on whatever you're targeting, and then you can just hit it again. It is extremely powerful. Now, something else that happens is you will see an effect up here. If I go ahead and hit the wand spec again, it is this effect right here, and basically it is just a 40% damage increase while it's active for combust. So combust, with all of these different effects, if you stack it up all the way, it can hit very high. So say I go ahead and wand spec and then I hit a rack and ruin, I hit a dragon breath, and I hit my corrupt. That is a lot of damage. Remember, I'm not overloaded. There is no prayer on, no pocket slot, no nothing, auras, nothing. That was a 1600 corrupt bleed just for fun. It stacks with everything. Like, you can get your Carapac wrist wraps to stack in with it and give you an extra damage there. It is wild what you can do with combust now. So a lot of you might be wondering right now, well, where does that leave FSOA? Is it just EOF fodder? Do I really do anything with it? And what I will say is the need for FSOA has changed, but its special attack is still very strong, and having a tier 95 or tier 100 auto stick is helpful still in Magic DPM. And for those unaware, there are the shards of Genesis Essence that you can get from the new place in which these wands come from, and that allows you to upgrade any T95 to a tier 100. It's about a 3% damage increase, assuming you have 100% accuracy somewhere, but obviously if you don't have 100% accuracy, you're going to notice more damage just because you're actually able to get full value from your abilities. Personally, I still use my FSOA all over the place, and now that it's a tier 100, it kind of puts Inquisitor staff in the bin, in my opinion. Technically, Inquisitor is still better, being that it's like a tier 104.8 or a tier 105, so if it does work, you can use Inquisitor as an auto stick instead of FSOA, but the gap is close enough between the two weapons now to where I'm not too worried about it when it comes to 4-ticking. And that'll lead me to how I've implemented 4-ticking with the new passives being so strong and you always wanting to be on dual wield for these effects. 4-tick has definitely changed. It is much more niche now when it comes to implementing with damage, but it still offers a pretty good damage increase. Now I'm going to nerd out a little bit here on 4-ticking specifically, so hopefully you're able to follow along, but essentially what we used to do for 4-tick is we would go ahead and hit a ability like this one, swap over, and then hit auto attack and ability with the staff equipped, and we would just go about our day. This was a good form of DPS increase because two-handers have a much higher hit than our dual wield counterparts. That auto attack was a little bit low, but as you can see, that 1.1k with no buffs on or any prayers or anything like that compared to a 490. Sneaking in auto attacks is definitely a good form of damage increase. It is on the smaller end. It is by no means required to do good damage with magic, but it is an optional extra there for those who want to engage in that type of mechanic and really squeeze out every last bit of damage that magic has to offer. Now, way back when 4-ticking was kind of first discovered and really went through its main popularity, kind of back in the early AOD days anyway, Telos era, that type of stuff, we had this thing called continuous 4-tick, where you would equip your dual wield for an ability and then equip your staff, and then do staff, dual wield, equip, and ability, and you would just repeat this every single ability cycle. Now, continuous 4-tick was patched, meaning you can't do it every ability anymore, but the methodology of sneaking in a 4-tick auto and then incorporating your dual wield equip in between the auto press and your next ability still works. And we can take advantage of that with these new weapons. Because we want to keep our passive effect and our stack building up at all times and gain as much benefit from that as possible, we can continuous our abilities for 4-ticking, which real quick, again, for those who might not be understanding, in normal 4-ticking, we do a dual wield ability, equip our staff, then we hit auto attack with another ability with the staff equipped, then do a dual wield ability and repeat the process. But with the continuous style of 4-ticking, you're taking the dual wield input from after the staff ability and putting it in between the staff auto attack and the staff ability. And this is how you 4-tick into things like G-Conk before the whole update happened, because now Magic, you can just use your staff to hit G-Conk, and you can use Magma Tempest on dual wield. There's a lot of stuff you can do now. You can G-Sonic with dual wield. I pretty much took all the restrictions out of Magic, but before, if you wanted to 4-tick into a G-Conk, you would have to continuous the ability. So it would be like use an ability here, equip the staff, and then auto, dual wield equip, and G-Conk. And then the auto attack would sneak out, and then you would be just fine. And this methodology is going to allow us to use all of the effects from the dual wield set while still getting staff autos incorporated into our rotations. Now, in this section of the update, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about how bleeds work specifically and how we can take advantage of this, keeping in mind about the stuff we just learned about. But you might be thinking to yourself, all right, if I'm putting on a staff during my global cooldown to sneak out staff autos, even if I'm continuousing to minimize the amount of time I have my staff equipped, wouldn't that still be a reduction in bleed damage? And the fun answer there is no, it absolutely doesn't affect that. So right now I have my dual wield weapons equipped, and if I go ahead and hit combust on a max hit dummy, you'll see it is hitting 846. That is what combust is going to do with my current buff setup, which is nothing. And if I go ahead and equip my staff, I gotta find combust here, there it is, and I put it on the max hit dummy, you'll notice it is a 651. So now we have the two values for the 30% difference, because 846 is 30% higher than 641 or 643, whatever it is. And if I now go ahead and use combust here, I can switch between every single bleed hit, no matter which weapon I'm using, and I will get the same value as the weapons that I used to apply it in the first place. This also even works for the wand spec. It is just taking the value that was used on cast and then using that for the duration of the bleeds. Bleeds do not get retroactively affected based on weapons that you are equipping. And this makes sense. Again, this is going to be a little bit of a tangent here, but it is extra context to understand why it's happening this way. Back in the good old days of Melee, so think of 2018 to 2021, I believe this was patched even later than that, but when Melee was in its heyday, what we used to do was use Barge to bleed our Assault, and if that target was T-Maul susceptible, you would bleed the Assault bleed with your Pterosaur Maul, so it's getting the damage and accuracy increase from the T-Maul effect, but then it is pulling the raw data from the weapon equipped for the rest of the bleed. So we would switch to our Kopeshes, and instead of a tier 80 Assault bleed getting buffed to be about a tier 97, because the enchantments weren't out back then, it's now basing the 12.5% damage increase, I believe it's 12.5% anyways, off of the damage value for a tier 92 weapon, because T-Maul is tier 80, Kopeshes are tier 92, you're getting all that additional damage. Bleeds back then were retroactively changing based on whatever weapons you were wearing. But obviously that got patched at some point and it works across the board, so now when it comes to these dual wield weapons, we're able to switch weapons freely, and whatever you use to cast the bleed, that's what it's going to stay as no matter what. Another point I wanted to touch on, because there are some very interesting mechanics here with how the bleeds work, is with the usage of G-Chain or Greater Chain. So how Greater Chain normally works is it will go out, hit the primary target, and it will search for up to 2 other additional targets and hit those as well. Now, if you're using something like a Coroming swap, this is up to 6 additional targets, so 7 in total. And then whatever ability you use next, it will hit every single one of the targets that the G chain hit. Now, all of the secondary targets, so like if I'm targeting this one, the one that I'm targeting, this is considered primary target. The other two are considered secondary targets. And if I go ahead and use an ability after a G chain, you'll notice I use the wild magic. This hits pretty high, but these hit lower. It's because secondary targets only take 50% of the original damage that you hit on your primary target. And this still holds true with these new weapons, but if you use a bleed with the greater chain, bleeds for the proccing effect from the corruption stack are not treated as an all-in-one solution. Now, what I mean by that is conventional wisdom would tell you that if I G-chain this dummy here, and it hits both of these, and then I get a proc on my combust from the essence corruption stacks, it would tell you, okay, it's going to use the primary data, it's going to use the data from my primary target, and it's just going to cause everything to get hit all at once. But that is not how it works with G-Chain. For some reason, it hits all of the potential targets and each one rolls for the 1 in 3 chance. Because it's a 30% chance to refresh your bleeds, so roughly speaking, and I know 1 in 3 is considered 33.3 repeating, but I'm just gonna call it a 1 in 3 for simplicity's sake. Each target will roll, and if you remember earlier, you saw this dummy on the right got the proc and refreshed my combust, but the other two were still bleeding normally. So when it comes to AoE clearing, if you're using G-Chain with the wand spec and you have a lot of mobs, there is a very high chance that you are going to refresh your wand spec, which is a lot of damage. So if you're fighting a boss that happens to have a couple of mobs around it, before you go tossing out your wand spec, you might want to hit G-Chance just to give you better odds of refreshing said wand spec. It's also really funny when you get like the RNG roll of the century and you target the max number of targets possible with G-Chain and every single one of them hit the refresh and do damage instantly. That is always fun. Alrighty, let's go ahead and get into the meat and potatoes of this video, the rotation that I have been using so far. Now, yes, this rotation does include continuous autos, and what I'll be doing for shorthand or brevity reasons is just stating auto attack into something. So keep that in mind. I am going to be continuousing my abilities. Now, if you don't want a 4-tick and you still want to use this rotation, just pull the big picture ideas from it and subtract out the auto attacks. The timings might be slightly different, but the big picture idea is going to be the same. So essentially what I have been doing is I'll go ahead and drop my sun and then target cycle and hit smoke cloud with a G-Conk. And then since G-Conk gives a good buff, I'll go ahead and use dragon breath because it's a nice ability. And if you're attacking something that isn't poisonable and you want to go ahead and use combust and hope that you get a refresh, you can, but I wouldn't recommend that. I personally just use corrupt blast after that, and I will continuous into a corrupt blast. And after that, I just kind of go into a normal sun rotation where I'm looking for an omni power, a couple wild magics, a tendrils, as many Iban staff specs that I can reasonably get into a sun rotation. Some people have also been using Gothic staff, and it's definitely a improv thing to do where if you're not getting as much adrenaline, you can get in some Gothic staffs and it's still good damage. But if you're really over pumping adrenaline, you want to be using Iban staff because it's technically better DPS. And the main change I have made is after my first wild magic, I will use a wand spec because the corrupt blast will give you enough stacks for your wand spec to potentially reset itself, which you can then go ahead and use either later on in your sunshine, or you can use it after your sunshine pretty quickly. But I do go for at least one wand spec during a sunshine, and I have dropped the number of asphyxes I've used. Asphyxiate is a pretty weak ability at this point. I might use one in a sunshine, sometimes I don't even use any depending on how much adrenaline I'm getting. So those are kind of the big picture ideas, but let's actually go ahead and run a rotation. So my example rotation would look something like this. Go ahead and drop the sun and then target cycle smoke cloud into a G-Conk, D-breath, continuous into the Rut Blast, Nami, FSOA spec, another G-Conk into a wild magic, continuous into a wand spec, G-Conk. I'm going to hit 10Ds because I'm not really high on adrenaline right now. Maybe an Omni Power into an Iban since we got the Relent there. 4-tick into a G-Conk, another Iban, maybe a D-Breath. Vortic into another G-Conk, Wild Magic, and maybe another Iban to round out the spec. And then after this, I would go into like another Wand spec with the Combust, and then kind of just go from there and kind of just play with the damage that I have. Use another couple bleeds, build up more stacks, so on and so forth. So what is the big takeaway from these weapons, and how has it changed the rotations that I have been using? Well, the wand spec is pretty strong, and the random resets allows for improv on your bleeds, and the bleeds with the 30% buff are actually relatively worthwhile to use in Sunshine now. You obviously don't want to spam them, but I believe a procced bleed is stronger than any basic you're going to have, and I believe it's technically stronger than Asphyxiate, but that's just rough mental math going on right now. I could absolutely be wrong on that. The wand spec itself is dummy strong, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but it does have a 45-second cooldown, so if you get a refresh on your wand, that is massive amounts of damage, and it's why I go for a bleed on my third basic instead of just immediately going into a Nami FSOA, because I at least want one stack there to potentially reset my wand bleed, or my wand special attack, I should say. And other than that, I don't go for two-hit asphyxes anymore. I sometimes do one, but it's mostly as a filler, and I try to sneak in as many continuous vortex as I can. They usually just end up going into G-Conks because G-Conk is a very strong ability. And then if you're going for some filler damage in between suns, just play with the bleeds that you have and vorticking, maybe getting another wild magic. In between suns, you could then probably go for like a two-hit asphyx or something like that, maybe a couple G-staffs. But I believe I have yapped long enough about these weapons. Hopefully you found some of this information helpful. I'm going to be doing more testing with magic as we keep going on, so there might be more updates to my rotations in the future. Now in this video specifically, I'm talking about the DPS update. I do have some pretty strong feelings about their current price and kind of Sanctum of Rebirth overall. So if you want a video on like a content review of Sanctum of Rebirth in general, leave it in the comments below and tell me if you want to see something like that. But for this video specifically, I'm just going to keep that out there. I don't want to ramble on for another like hour. So I will go ahead and call the video there. Thank you very much for watching. Your viewership is greatly appreciated. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, nighttime, whatever it is, wherever you are. I'll see you next time for the next video. Peace.